In the late summer of 1969, when I was 13 years old and starting high school, my mother gave me my first typewriter. It was a heavy, iron black machine that required me to strike the keys very forcefully. My mother thought I should start typing up my assignments for school, which I did, but I also used that typewriter to write the first articles I submitted to my high school newspaper. The funny thing is that I never learned how to type correctly. Back in 1969, in my high school, you could only take a typing class if you were a girl training to be a secretary. I was in a curriculum aimed at academic preparation for college, so I had no choice but to teach myself to type. For the first year or so, I did it with one finger, the index finger on my left hand, since I am left-handed. Then I was able to start using the index finger of my right hand, a great step forward for me. At one time toward the end of my high school years, I bought an instruction book with diagrams of the keyboard and exercises to teach you how to type with it, with all 10 fingers. It was a method called touch typing. But the process of following the diagrams and doing the exercises made me so slow that I reverted back to my 2 fingers. I am now 63 years old, and I still type with just 2 fingers. And I still hit the keys with a lot of force. Several times when I've been typing on an airplane flight, the passenger in front of me has turned around to ask me to stop typing so noisily. Over my years as a journalist, my way of typing is one of the few parts of my professional life that has stayed constant. I've gone from newsrooms that used early desktop computers to some of the first portable computers, which weren't even called laptops yet, to the era of smartphones, the internet, and social media. I've gone from being part of a news industry in the United States that was intensely concentrated in 3 major television networks, several general interest magazines with circulations in the tens of millions, and dominant national newspapers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. I've gone from that to a news industry that is splintered and fragmented into an immense and ever-growing number of publications, most of which operate online. It can be reassuring for me to still type up my own articles with 2 fingers, because that simple action reminds me that even as so many elements of journalism have changed with advances in technology and changes in the marketplace, some important aspects of our work should not change. A former colleague of mine at Columbia Journalism School, Professor Sig Gisler, who is also the administrator in charge of the Pulitzer Prizes, created a word to describe the ideal mix of old and new. He said today's journalist should be tradigital. You cannot find that word in any dictionary. Professor Gisler made it up. But here is what it means. Tra is from the word traditional. And digital is, of course, the word we use when we talk about digital technology, the digital revolution, and so on. Professor Gisler's tradigital journalist is someone who keeps the best part of the journalistic tradition while also being familiar with the newest technologies and making use of them to gather and share news. At my age, I have many longtime friends in journalism who complain that the internet, social media, cable television, YouTube, etc., are ruining journalism. They think the professionals have been outnumbered by the amateurs. They complain about the number of journalists who've been laid off from their jobs and the number of newspapers that have closed down. These complaints do have some merit, but for most of my years as a professional journalist, there has always been a sense that the good old days are over, that the golden age was somewhere in the past. For example, after I graduated from college in 1977, I had a summer job on the Minneapolis Star. At that time, Minneapolis had 2 competing newspapers, The Tribune published in the morning and the Star in the afternoon. It was very typical for major American cities back then to have at least two newspapers. But the growing audience for evening newscasts on television was reducing the number of readers and buyers for afternoon newspapers. Many of them began to close. And in 1982, the Minneapolis Star became one of them. I was not on the paper then, but a friend of mine saved the last edition for me. In it, one of the Star's columnists wrote in a very emotional tone that when you see afternoon newspapers closing and major cities having only one daily newspaper, then you know that American journalism is dying. Well, here we are 41 years later, and journalism is not dead at all. Yes, there have been closings and layoffs, but thanks to the digital revolution, there are also hundreds or even thousands of journalism startups that are hiring tens of thousands of young reporters, editors, photographers, web designers, and videographers. In the early 1980s, when I was working on a newspaper in the suburbs of Chicago, I had to drive to the one local store that carried the Sunday edition of the New York Times. If I was just a few minutes too late, all of the 5 copies would have been bought already, and there was no New York Times for me. Now, thanks to the digital revolution, I can read the New York Times on my laptop or my smartphone. It's a Samsung. On my smartphone virtually anywhere in the world. When the London subway was bombed in 2005, I could read coverage instantly from the BBC and The Guardian. When Israel and Hezbollah fought a war in the summer of 2006, I could read the coverage from both Lebanese and Israeli English-language newspapers while sitting at my desk in Manhattan. The access all of us have now is extraordinary. And the digital tools to report are extraordinary too. The movement against police brutality in the United States, called the Black Lives Matter movement, was made possible by the use of smartphones. Civilians who witnessed or experienced brutality from police officers were able to make video recordings, which were then made available to journalists. Search engines like Google, if used wisely, have made it far more efficient to do research. Being online is like having membership in the world's largest and greatest library. Social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter allow journalists to locate sources almost anywhere in the world and to publish their work to a global audience. So I am convinced that more great journalism is being produced now than at any time that I've ever lived, and probably at any other time in human history. And the efforts of President Trump to attack the American media as the enemy of the people and to call our product fake news have had an unexpected effect. Yes, many of his supporters believe him, but much of the public values a free press more than ever before because it feels endangered. Online subscriptions for newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post have grown rapidly in the Trump years, and many of my students at Columbia have gone into journalism precisely because the president's campaign against journalism and journalists proves to these young people, and maybe to you too, how important and necessary the news media is. There is a phrase in American journalism, there's a phrase rather in American jargon, that you can look at a glass of water as being half full or half empty. I've just given you the half full version of journalism in the digital era. Now, let me give you the half empty version. By that, I mean the challenges posed to journalism by the digital revolution. In terms of the economics of the news industry, the digital revolution has created a far more competitive market than ever before and has disrupted the revenue streams that had sustained major newspapers and magazines. Classified advertising, the small ads about an apartment to rent or a bicycle for sale, things like that, classified advertising has moved to free sites like Craigslist. Display advertising from large businesses like airlines, restaurants, and clothing stores was placed in targeted online portals rather than on the printed pages in publications. Readers who used to have no choice but to pay for a publication if they wanted to read it could now click their way to free views online. Or more recently, they follow Twitter tweets or Facebook posts to the articles that interest them. It is no wonder, then, that news organizations have struggled to find new ways to financially survive. At the outset of the digital era, some tried paywalls, which failed largely because consumers were not yet accustomed to paying simply to view content on a computer. Then, news organizations tried making all their content free and available in the hope that so many readers would come to the website that advertisers would follow. But not enough advertisers in enough volume ever did follow. Instead, many put their ads on aggregating sites like Yahoo rather than on any news organization's own site. And finally, in the last few years, major newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post have succeeded with partial paywalls that offer a very low starting price, usually about $1 a week, and access to about 10 articles a month free. But newspapers without the national or international impact of the Times or the Post have not had similar success. In the United States, you need a license and a specific course of study to take on many occupations: doctor, lawyer, real estate agent, teacher, financial advisor, even cosmetologist. But there has never been any form of licensing or required education for journalists. The advantage of that lack of control is that the government cannot use licenses as a way of restricting freedom of the press. The disadvantage is that it has been left up to journalists themselves to establish best practices and ethical standards. When the news media was more concentrated just 20 or 25 years ago, it was easier to establish an informal consensus. That consensus believed that journalists should be impartial and nonpartisan, should accurately and honestly report facts, and should restrict opinion to clearly marked opinion pages. News organizations as a whole saw their role as helping to create the informed citizens who are necessary for a healthy democracy. Needless to say, the news media often fell short of those goals, but at least there was a good faith effort to meet them. There's an old joke that says freedom of the press belongs only to people who can afford to buy a printing press. And it is true that in the pre-internet years, it took a tremendous amount of money to operate a newspaper or magazine or radio station or TV station. Diverse voices were not present. The voice of American journalism then was the voice of the straight white male. But on the other hand, amateurs and ideologues could not as easily set up shop. The digital revolution changed all of that. Anyone able to design a website or later to open up a social media account could start functioning as a journalist. And online, that person's work would be as readily accessible as the work of a trained, experienced, professional journalist on a respected, long-standing news organization. Some startup sites were terrific. Others were deeply flawed, inaccurate, barely edited, poorly written. And still others were essentially political or ideological movements pretending to be news organizations. The former senator and diplomat Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said, "Everybody is entitled to his own opinion, but nobody is entitled to his own facts." Unfortunately, in the era of online journalism and social media, at least in the United States, a great many people believe they are entitled to their own facts. My nation is deeply divided these days, more divided than I've ever seen it in my life, in part because there is no longer a national narrative, a set of public facts and truths. Liberals and Democrats tend to rely on carefully edited and fact-checked news organizations like the Times, the Post, CNN, and National Public Radio. But conservatives and Republicans get their information primarily from right-wing media such as Breitbart, Fox News, and the Daily Caller. At the level of the individual journalist, the challenge of being tradigital is to hold on to the values we consider sacred, even when those values are under attack, especially when those values are under attack. We must be more committed than ever to searching out and verifying facts. We must be vigilant in putting aside our own political beliefs when reporting on issues. We must not let opinion seep into news coverage. We must always remember, in this time when every news organization is on deadline every second of every day, competing against every other news organization in the world, we must remember that it is better to get a story right than it is to upload a story first. Factual errors fly around the internet instantaneously, and even if they are later corrected, the damage caused by inaccurate information cannot be undone. After 2 terrorists set off a bomb at the Boston Marathon several years ago, a totally unfounded rumor went around online that a particular college student was a suspect. Legitimate professional journalists for several TV networks retweeted and forwarded that report, which made it seem even more legitimate. In fact, the college student was missing from his family and was later found to have committed suicide. He had absolutely nothing to do with the bombing. The ease of doing research online is a great boon to journalists, but also a potential trap. In cyberspace, we do not know who we're really talking to. That problem became especially vivid during the early months of the peaceful protests against Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. A lot of news organizations in Europe and the United States did not keep reporters in Syria, partly because of the cost and partly because of the danger. So when a blogger using the name Gay Girl in Damascus started posting the inside story of political activists like herself, publications began quoting her dispatches without ever confirming her identity. Then one day, the cousin of Gay Girl in Damascus posted through the account that the blogger had been arrested and taken away by the Syrian secret police. The cousin asked Western journalists to demand the release of Gay Girl, and many news organizations did so. Only then did a few skeptics try to determine who Gay Girl in Damascus actually was. Her online photo, it turned out, had been stolen from the social media account of another woman. Gay Girl in Damascus was finally revealed to be a straight white guy from America who had created the online persona because he felt sympathetic to the pro-democracy demonstrators. I don't blame him for being a fake. I blame us journalists for being too complacent to make sure Gay Girl was real. So both the opportunities and the obstacles abound for doing responsible and ethical journalism in the digital era. But one thing I do know is that when something is scarce, it becomes more valuable. That is the economic principle of supply and demand. And when our readers, viewers, and listeners feel surrounded by versions of journalism that are blatantly biased or indifferent to accuracy and factuality, they will value the best kind of journalism more than ever. And you are, the very fortunate people who can provide it to them. Thank you.